It behooves us to understand that our brains are question-answering machines. That's exactly how our brains interrogate and figure out the world. So it's constantly asking questions. What we also have to understand is when we deliberately lodge a question into our frontal lobe, our conscious mind, our brain has no choice but to begin to come up with answers, okay? We do this oftentimes without thinking about it, but we do it the wrong way. We say things like, why am I so bad at this? Why does this always happen to me? Why are these people out to get me? As soon as we ask ourselves that question, our brain begins to come up with answers. And I guarantee you those answers aren't very empowering, and a lot of them are likely ridiculous. Every high performing team I've ever encountered, every high performing human being that I've ever encountered has always asked better questions. So things like, what can I learn here? What am I good at? Who's out there that can help me? What can I do in this moment? And so, yeah, I'm a true believer that the quality of our lives is directly proportional to the quality of questions we ask ourselves on a consistent basis.
Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure.
I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue.
It's great to get in the game, but don't get in the game till you understand the rules, till you're an insider.
Your life changes when you begin having a different conversation in your head.
What we need to do in radically deep problems is propose radically visionary solutions.
Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Greetings everyone, my name is Julie Masters and welcome to another episode of Inside Influence, in which I delve into the minds of some of the world's most fascinating influencers or experts in influence to get to the bottom of what it really takes to own your voice and then amplify it to drive an industry, a conversation, a movement, or a nation. Now here's today's question. What are the hidden attributes of high performance? What makes the influence of one person or one leader completely stand apart from the rest? Now notice I'm not talking about skills here. In the words of my guest today, skills and attributes are two completely different things. Skills describe the tools that we use when the environment is familiar, whereas attributes, on the other hand, describe how you show up, especially when the going gets hard. Now, I'm a firm believer that if you really want to develop mastery in any area, you need to step into the arena where the stakes are the highest. If you want to understand negotiation, ask an FBI hostage negotiator. If you want to really understand perception and how to direct attention, ask a magician who performs nightly in front of thousands of people. And if it's the secrets to a compelling speech that you're looking for, turn to a presidential speechwriter who has had to take some of the greatest and most harrowing moments of our time and commit them to words. Now that's the driving philosophy pretty much behind this entire podcast, which is why today, when it came to exploring the topic of peak performance, I sought out the wisdom of one particular man. Rich Diviney is a former SEAL commander who has served up to 13 overseas deployments over 21 years as an active member and officer of the armed forces' most elite group. Over that time, he became obsessed with understanding what differentiates those who prevail from those who fail. And what he discovered completely changed his perception of human performance. Throughout that career, he was intimately involved in a specialized SEAL selection process. And the intention of that process was to whittle down hundreds of Spec Ops candidates down to just a handful of the most elite performers. However, oddly, what he started to notice was that those candidates that washed out and those that succeeded usually completely defied his predictions. Some could have all the right skills and still fail. Others just didn't seem to fit the bill, but would prove to be top performers. And as it turned out, skills alone just were not telling him what he needed to know. So, over time, Rich began to conclude that beneath the skills, beneath the obvious skills that he was trained to look for, were the hidden drivers of performance. The core attributes, including grit, adaptability, courage, and resilience, that determined how successful we were going to be when the going gets tough. This conclusion evolved into a Spec Ops training program called Mind Gym, the first of its kind, scientifically devised to help elite soldiers perform faster, longer, and better in high-stakes situations. He now works as a speaker, facilitator, and consultant with the Chapman & Co. Leadership Institute and Simon Sinek, Inc. He's taught leadership and optimal performance to more than 5,000 businesses, athletic, and military leaders from organizations as diverse as American Airlines, the San Francisco 49ers, Zoom, we all know Zoom, and Deloitte. In his latest book, which is called The Attributes, 25 Hidden Drivers of Optimal Performance, Rich defines and examines these attributes to explain how we perform as individuals and also how we perform best as a team. In this conversation, we dove into why quitting is different to giving up and why that's important. Where giving up is a slow process, quitting can be the key to taking back your strength and moving on when all the signs show it's time to change direction. We talk about the power of grit and what it means to be resilient, and why reframing holds the key to staying in motion. Why freezing when the unexpected happens is actually a really important strategy. Now, this one kind of blew my mind. I had thought that freezing was the last thing that you wanted to do. However, the SEALs are trained, rather than immediately moving into fight or flight, to actually freeze first and then ask themselves a series of vital questions before choosing their next move. We also go into the courage that it takes to speak truth to power and the impact it has on trust, loyalty, and those who are willing to follow you into the fire potentially years after they've left your command. And why the quality of our lives is directly proportionate to the quality of our questions, and how to start harnessing the potential of your mind as a question answering machine. Rich also has some incredible suggestions for powerful questions you can start feeding into your brain to immediately get better results. Now, if there's something that has struck me since speaking with Rich, it's probably summed up in this sentence: the audacity of making a hostile environment your safe haven. Now, he talks about this as being one of the reasons that he joined the SEALs in the first place. And it got me thinking, what feels like a hostile environment to you right now? It might be a situation, it might be a situation at work or at home, it might be the state of your industry or just the world at large. But here's a better question. What attributes could you consciously and deliberately start developing, like courage or adaptability, in order to make that exact environment, that exact hostile environment, your new comfort zone? And how might that change the game completely? Now, if you're looking to take your journey and influence to the next level right now, don't forget to hop onto my website or the show notes and download the brand new version of my ebook, The Influencer Code. It covers the 7 areas and 7 core questions. Remember what I said about questions? That I have found to be hands down to be the most useful when it comes to rapidly increasing your level of influence. Just pop in your email address. It will land in your inbox in the time it takes to pour a cup of tea. My newsletter, Influence Insider, also gives 1 weekly bite-sized tool, strategy, or mindset shift, all on the topic of building a more influential life. They're short, they're sharp, and my intention is to make them wholly usable. So once again, hop onto my website, juliemasters.com, to become an insider. On that note, sit back, march on, and get ready for the curious and deeply insightful human being that is Rich Diviney. Welcome to the podcast, Rich Diviney.
Thanks, Julie. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure to have you here. I'm going to kick off the podcast the way that I always kick the podcast off, and that is to ask, what idea is having the most influence on you at the moment? And the reason I ask, for those who are regular listeners, you'll know, is because people who are on the edges of their field, who are leading the conversations in their field, usually find really incredible ideas before the rest of us. So what one idea is having the most impact on your thinking?
Yeah, I'm going to change my answer in the last 30 seconds, because the idea that I've been thinking about a lot, in fact, I just wrote a piece on this, is this idea that quitting is not the same as giving up. And I wrote a piece on this because what occurred to me is that quitting is in fact kind of an acute singular act, right? And it's very very present when you quit. I'm going to quit my workout. I'm going to quit my run. I'm going to quit, quit doing whatever I'm doing, right? Giving up means there's more longevity to giving up. It means I'm ceasing to try. I'm ceasing effort. I'm stopping my effort in doing something. And so what I realized, because this whole Olympic stuff was going on, and Simone Biles, she dropped out of some events, and then of course here in the States there was the normal kind of bifurcation of of opinions, because everything has to be binary nowadays, and a lot of people were hailing her as a hero, and some people were saying she's a quitter, and of course I'm someone who really believes, I've done hundreds of combat missions, and the Navy SEAL mantra people think is, hey, never quit, and that's true, but it's only kind of true. I've out of hundreds of missions, I've actually quit on 3. And when I say quit, I mean I've been the officer in charge, and I've decided, hey, we're going to stop, and we're going to return to base. We're not going to continue on with the mission. And the reason why I made that decision is because you continuously assess and read the environment, and what I think we all have to recognize is if we're not continually assessing and reading the environment and recognizing when we may be going down the wrong path, we are going to hurt ourselves. We're going to put ourselves in danger. We will not accomplish our goals. So I said to myself, it seems to me that in fact the secret to success is not necessarily to never quit. It's almost I'm gonna quit as many times as I have to until I find the right way to do it. Just so the idea is you can quit as many times as you have to, but never give up, right? Because giving up is more long term.
I mean, what you're saying there is that giving up it feels incremental, right?
Yeah.
Giving up is a over a period of time where you just slowly and quietly retract your energy and effort to the point where you kind of the wheels just stop spinning.
That's right.
Whereas quitting has a certainty to it. There's leadership to quitting.
Well, and also so just take the example of quitting a workout. I mean, I might be in my workout. I might find, man, I pull a muscle, or I feel something wrong. It's like I need to quit my workout. That doesn't mean I'm giving up on getting in shape or giving up on becoming healthy. I'm quitting the moment because the moment is not feeling like it's in concert or in conduct of my overall goal. So I think we have to almost, I think, when we're looking at especially long-term goals and what we're doing, and the reason it occurred to me is because a lot of people, especially in the States, they're quitting their jobs. They've come out of the pandemic, and the quarantine made them recognize, I'm not happy doing what I'm doing. I'm not fulfilled doing what I'm doing. So they're quitting their jobs, and there's actually nothing wrong with that. If they are doing, as long as it's not because it's hard, right? You don't want to quit just because it's hard. But if you're taking an honest look at the direction you're heading, the path you're on, you're saying, you know what, this path is not getting me to where I want to go. Quit what you're doing and try something new. That's the idea.
I just want to dive into that very quickly, because there's something here really for right now.
Yeah.
As you said, there's a lot of people quitting their jobs. There's a lot of people doing side hustles. There's a lot of people quitting the way they used to do family. Mm-hmm. Quitting. I mean, I can think even in my own life. We used to do family this way. There's parts of that weren't working, but we were just too much in motion to reconsider them. So when you're in that moment, when you're feeling like, okay, something's not working here, is there a barometer that you use? Is there like I don't want to say checklist, but is there something in your gut where you go, okay, are these things true? And if they are, it's time to quit.
That's a great question. And I think there should be some sort of mental checklist. And the way I would describe that is if I were to take one of the missions that we were on. In fact, I was telling a story about it was the very first mission that I was on. We had just gotten to Afghanistan for one of our deployments. I had just taken over the specific SEAL troop. So it was my first time in charge of this specific SEAL troop. I'd worked very hard to get there. I was very excited. It was our very first mission in country. And it was as we were, and so the mission we were going to do, it seemed like a pretty simple one, fairly simple objective. The terrain was simple. The plan seemed fairly simple. During the planning process, though, we started getting a few hiccups, right? The comms frequencies had to be changed. The routes were a little bit difficult. Some of the gear we were going to use wasn't available. And so of course we adjust and we kind of move on. And then of course we're on our way into the target, and a couple more things happen. The comms, in fact, and the vehicles hadn't been changed, so we had to pull over and change those. And then we found that the routes that we had chosen weren't good, and so we had to move to a secondary and a tertiary route. So the timeline began to expand. And so, and all little things that weren't insurmountable, but were, I ticked away in my brain, because whenever you read any type of after action report on any tragedy, whether it's a military one or an air disaster, whatever, it's almost always a series of little things that add up to this big thing. And we always
Death
say
by a thousand cuts.
and yeah, so you always say hindsight is 20/20, and of course all of us on the back end are saying, how could they not have seen this, right? But these little things, if you're not taking notice, they will add up without you knowing. So I always say there was never a specific number of things that made me click over and say, okay, that's it. But there is going to be enough where you say, you know what, this doesn't seem like it's working. I think it's time we turn around. And so whether it's a mission, whether it's a pathway we're on, whether it's parenting, whether it's the way we're working, I think it would behoove us to make that list in our heads, because it's always a bunch of little things, and little things are always easy to say, okay, it's okay, forget about it. But it's the adding up of the little things that eventually lead to either tragedy or failure, or man, this was just a wrong pathway to go. So I think what you're saying makes sense.
And there's also another language for that, right? That feeling of being out of flow. Mm-hmm. The difference between being in flow when, it's not easy, you might not be having fun, you might not be happy, but you're moving forwards and things, one breadcrumb after another breadcrumb after another breadcrumb, things are working. Yeah. You feel like you're moving with a tide. Right. And then there's the other feeling of the banging your head against a brick wall. Nothing is working here, and I can keep going until I have a very sore head, or I can stop, retreat, reconsider. Yeah.
And then it all takes thought and introspection, because again, I talk about perseverance as an attribute, and the way I deconstruct perseverance as an attribute, I say it's a mixture of tenacity, persistence, and fortitude. And it's interesting because if you look at persistence and tenacity, they're actually in fact not the same thing. Persistence is I'm going to in the effort to solve a problem or accomplish an act, I'm going to do the same thing over and over and over again until it happens, right? This is it's the stonecutter approach, right? The stonecutter taps the same spot, 99 times and sees nothing, and then the 100th tap, the rock breaks, right? That's the stonecutter. That's what persists. So the stonecutter needs persistence, right? Tenacity is different. Tenacity is I'm going to try something, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to try something else, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to try something else. That's the car mechanic approach, right? The car mechanic's going to look at the belts, and then if it's not the belts, go to the carburetor. If it's not the carburetor, go to the spark plugs, whatever it is. Well, if you have a tenacious stonecutter, you're never going to get a stone carved, right? If you have a persistent mechanic, you're going to just end up with a large bill, and your car's not going to get fixed. But as human beings, as people who kind of work in life, right, we actually have to balance both, because sometimes persistence is necessary, and then sometimes tenacity is necessary. Fortitude is actually kind of the mental toughness to be able to move through either one. But regardless of any of that, it takes a deliberate thought process to say, okay, is this something that, in fact, will take and needs persistence? In other words, I know if I just keep on doing this. Listen, if you keep on working out, if you keep on eating healthy, you may not see results in the first week. You may not see results in the second week. You may not see the results in the third week. But you will see results, right? That's where persistence matters, right? Or it might be something else, tenacity, where, hey, I need to try something, and if it doesn't work, I need to try something else, And so all of this takes some introspection, some thought, and some real kind of decision-making on our part to decide, is this something that I need to quit and try something? Tenacity, in fact, is just a different form of quitting. Right? So,
but as a leader as well, and I love the fact that we're getting into some of these attributes just even with this question. As a leader, it takes a part of you always being in observer mode. Mm-hmm. All the while I'm listening to you, and having been someone who's led a large team and not in the same context as you, but there's the part of you that has to be in the doing, the getting done, the ticking of boxes. Mm-hmm. And then there always has to be a part of you that remains stepped back in observer mode, going, okay, I'm watching this as well as doing. Yeah. What have you learned about that balance, about keeping that balance between observer and in the trenches doing?
Well, I think interestingly, I think the best leadership is mostly observing, because again, I kind of say that if you're not, as a leader, if you're not doing your job, well, I should say this. I used to tell my junior officers, you have to accept the irony, what I call the irony of leadership, which is if you do your job correctly, you eventually work yourself out of a job, because your job as a leader is to create a team of people who actually can run without you, and in fact can eventually outpace you. And so as a leader, our job is to empower and to inspire and to develop, right? To create new leaders. And so if we do our job correctly, what we're doing is we're creating a team and a group that actually does the stuff, right? And we shouldn't necessarily be in the trenches unless we really, really have to be. And certainly there are some cases where the leader has to step in and say, okay, this is what, because that's what we do. This is what we're going. This is the direction we're going. But that has to be few and far between. It has to be more extreme. And I'll tell you, even in some of the extreme situations, if you've developed your team right, you're going to have people who are making those decisions, without your. They don't need your guidance because they already have your direction, your guidance, your purpose, and they're inspired to work. So I think the best type of leadership is much more, hey, I'm actually, my job is to step up, to see the whole thing kind of from the 50,000-foot view, and then make course corrections or little tweaks for the team, because that's where they need me to be. Because again, my snipers and my reconnaissance guys don't need me next to them planning the routes, like looking at the next step. They need me back. They need me looking at the whole picture. So I think that's the best form of leadership, is to be probably 90 to 95% observing from the 50,000-foot view, and then maybe 5% kind of directing or in the weeds, versus the 50-50, or in some cases some leaders, they're not really leaders, they're more micromanagers who think they need to be 85% in the weeds and 15% observing.
But that includes the distance to be able
That's
to make
right.
the gut call of this isn't, in the overall picture, this isn't working.
That's right. You need, because you need to have that view, because you need to be able to, your job is to take in all the information, so that no one else has to. And that takes altitude, and that means you have to build an environment of action and especially trust. The team has to trust each other, trust you, and then you actually can fulfill your role as a leader.
I want to jump into the attributes now. Now, you noticed when you were in the SEALs that those who succeeded weren't necessarily who you expected to succeed, and that the ones that did succeed had certain attributes. Talk to me about the difference there between. Let's start with the difference between skills and attributes, because there's a fundamental difference there, right? There
is, and the difference it came to light in my experience as I was running a different version of SEAL training. I wasn't running the basic SEAL training. I was running selection and training for one of our more elite SEAL teams. And it was, and in doing so, because we had attrition, about a 50% attrition, we had to find a better way to articulate why guys weren't making through. Because in my particular case, the training I was running, we were getting very experienced SEALs to come to our selection and training, and still getting about a 50% attrition rate. So when you tell a very experienced SEAL who has like 10 years as a SEAL in combat and everything that, hey, I'm sorry you didn't have you didn't cut it to be here. You need more than just you can't shoot very well. It doesn't make sense. And so it led me to A, look back, and B, kind of think about the difference between skills and attributes. And one of the kind of aha moments I had was when I thought about basic SEAL training, which is BUDS, basic underwater demolition / SEAL training. It's where a Navy recruit goes to the initial 6-month kind of hellish course where you go through and you become a Navy SEAL on the back end, and the attrition for that is about 90%, right? So like my class started with 165 or so, we graduated at 38, and that's normal numbers, right? And I thought back, in basic SEAL training, anybody spends hundreds of hours running with big heavy boats on their heads. We spend hundreds of hours exercising with 300-pound telephone poles and running around those things, and then freezing in the surf zone. And I thought about it. I've been on hundreds of combat missions overseas, and never on one did I carry a boat on my head or a 300-pound telephone pole on my shoulder. So what it told me was that when we were doing that in SEAL training, they weren't in fact training us to be Navy SEALs. They were actually just putting us into situations to tease out these qualities. And that began to kind of highlight the difference between skills and attributes. And so real briefly, skills are things, they're not inherent, they're things that are not inherent to our nature. We're not born with the ability to ride a bike or shoot a gun or drive a car. We're taught and we train to do those things. The skills also direct our behavior in known environments and specific environments, right? Here's how and when to drive a car. Here's how and when to shoot a gun. Here's how and when to throw a ball. And then because they're visible and they're tangible, they're very easy to assess, measure, and test. You can score them. You can see how well anybody does any one of those things. You can score them. You can put stats around them. You can measure them. You can put them on resumes. What what skills don't tell us is how people are going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty. Because in an unknown environment, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to apply a known skill. And so in those environments, we lean on attributes. Attributes are inherent, right? We're all born with levels of situational awareness, patience, adaptability, resilience. Now, certainly they develop over time and experience, but you can see levels of this stuff in small children. I mean, as parents, we know. I mean, you can see you can see if a 1-year-old is inherently patient or inherently impatient. I mean, you can see it, and they develop, but the thing about attributes is they don't tell us, they don't dictate behavior, they inform behavior, right? So my son's levels of perseverance and resilience informed the way he showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike, and he was falling off a dozen times, right? So they inform how we're going to show up. And then because they're hidden, because they're kind of hard to see, they are very difficult to assess, measure, and test. You can't necessarily sit across an interview with a candidate for a business and assess their level of resilience or their level of adaptability, right? They are the most visible during times of stress, challenge, and uncertainty. So this is why the laboratory that I had was so perfect. And then, of course, I got out of the Navy and I realized that a lot of businesses were coming to me and saying, hey, we're forming dream teams, the best marketer, the best salesperson, the best accountant, whatever it is. We're putting all these dream people together, and it's going well for a few days or weeks. But as soon as things go sideways, as soon as the plan changes or doesn't go as we planned, the teams start to turn toxic. What's going on? And I said, well, the reason why it's turning toxic is because you're selecting your teams based on the wrong things. You're selecting them based on skills versus attributes. Human beings are inherently unpredictable beings, right? So to design a team of humans based on a bunch of skills that we think are going to fit like puzzle pieces is not going to work. We have to do it based on attributes, because attributes are going to tell us how we actually perform and interact with each other. So that was really the impetus of the book. And then, of course, I realized, hey, someone should write a book on this, and so I did.
And why not you?
Yeah, why not me? Yeah.
I love that definition there. The definition of attributes that I just took out of what you said, how you show up when it's hard. Mm-hmm. And those are the people you want to be on teams with. Those are people you want to be in a marriage with. Mm-hmm. Those are the people that you want as friends, like people who show up when it's hard. But that brings me to the next kind of natural question for me, whereas it's easier to train for skills.
Totally, yeah.
Because you can break a skill down into its component parts. You can wire yourself for skills. How do you train for attributes?
Yeah. I don't know if you train for attributes. You develop attributes, and you're right. In fact, that's a good. You brought up a good kind of point that I'll say. A back of the envelope test to determine whether or not it's a skill or an attribute, because they get conflated all the time, would be to ask yourself, can I teach it or can it be taught? If the answer is yes, it's probably a skill. If the answer is no, it's probably an attribute. So the example would be Julie. Julie, you could say, Rich, I want to learn how to shoot a pistol and hit a bullseye every time. Okay, well, I could take you to the range and within 2 hours teach you how to do that. Okay, that is a skill. Or you could say, Rich, I want to learn how to be more adaptable or be more patient. Well, I can't teach you to do that, right? That's, so to develop an attribute takes self-motivation, takes self-direction, and then it takes a willingness for that individual to seek and find environments inside of which they can train, or I should say develop that attribute. So if someone wants to develop their patience, they need to then go find environments that test and tease their patience, right? So whatever that is, it could be I'm going to drive in traffic, or I'm going to stand at the longest line as the grocery store, or have kids. That's a really good one. if you want to develop patience.
I was just thinking that.
Right.
That was literally in my brain.
Yeah, so it's harder to develop attributes. It takes it's all inside of us. The good news is a couple bits of good news. The first bit of good news is that we all have all of the attributes. Okay, it's just the difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each. So adaptability is one I use as an example. If 10 is high and 1 is low, I'm about a level 8 on adaptability, right? Which means when the environment changes around me, outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow, right? I just do. I just adapt with it, and it's not difficult. It's just like, okay, whatever. Someone else might be a level 3 on adaptability, which means the same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them. It's painful. It's like hard. Now they're still adaptable. It's just a lot harder for them, right? So that's number one, is that we have to recognize we all have all the attributes. We're just different. The difference is the levels to which we have each. And the second piece of good news is we don't necessarily have to develop all the attributes we're low on, right? I mean, it really depends on the niche in life that we're in and what's required for that niche, right? The stand-up comic who's low on empathy doesn't necessarily need to develop his or her empathy. In fact, I would argue that too much empathy could be detrimental to a stand-up comic, right? Because how can you find the funny in a funeral if you're too empathetic, right? So the idea is to figure out where you stand on these things and then figure out, okay, based on my own kind of niche or whatever niche I want to go for or succeed in, what are those attributes that I'm a little low on that actually could help me in my endeavors? And then there might be some like, hey, I'm fine. I'm low on that. I mean, stand-up comic might not need a lot of the leadership attributes because it's a pretty, self-directed profession. You're not really leading anybody, so or a team or the team ability ones for that matter, right? So it's really it takes some introspection and kind of some analysis on ourselves, and that's kind of good news because no one should need to feel like, oh gosh, I have to be high on all this. It's impossible, and it's not necessary.
But it's good to have a blueprint, right?
It's good to have a blueprint, yeah.
It's good to have the markers along the way, and then you can choose the road.
Well, and I was saying,
without the map, you can't choose the road.
And I would say, I kind of say we're all, we always have to remember we're all human beings, but I would say we're kind of like automobiles. Like some of us are Jeeps, some of us are SUVs, some of us are Ferraris. And there's no judgment there because the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do, and the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do. But it would behoove us to lift our hood and figure out what type of engine we are, because we may be a Jeep that's been trying to run on a Ferrari track, or a Ferrari that's been trying to run on a Jeep track. And again, that's okay too. If I'm pretty much a Jeep if I were to classify myself. But if I were to say, hey, I'm a Jeep and I want to run on a Ferrari track, then I know, okay, based on my Jeep engine, these are the things I'm going to need to work on to run better on the Ferrari track. It's always a choice, right? But I also might be like, hey, I'm a Jeep, and I've been trying to run on the Ferrari track. Why don't I just go run on this Jeep track? I'll be much happier. I'll really excel. So I think that's where this type of self-analysis really helps someone.
Let's jump into some of these attributes now. So I wanted to start with grit. And it's a fairly obvious place to start. We've all needed our fair share recently, and for many, it's still a daily requirement to tap into our grit. Let's start with how do you define grit?
Yeah, grit was a cool one because it's the first category in the book, and it's also I don't put any value on the attributes, like these are more valuable than others, but I would say the grit ones are probably the most important ones in life. Grit is our ability as human beings, and a lot of people think of grit as its own singular attribute, but it's not. In fact, combination of things. It's the ability to kind of punch through those acute challenges and those acute obstacles, right? So the short term, like I'm just going to power through. I'm going to gut it out and persevere and just make it happen, right? Whereas the drive is more like, hey, long term, I'm going to set and achieve long term goals. But ultimately, grit from an attribute perspective comes down to 4 attributes: courage, adaptability, perseverance, and resilience. And it's a healthy dose of all 4 of those that actually bake and catalyze to come up with grit. Grit is the result of those, and they're really interesting. Courage is literally the ability to step into our fear. We can't, and again, courage cannot exist in the absence of fear. It's a cool saying that we've all heard before, but it's also neurologically been proven, right? Because there's actually what some have nicknamed kind of the fear circuit. When fear begins to bubble up, we get this the amygdala response, and we get this choice of fight or flight. Some people add freeze in there, but freeze is in fact neurologically just an oscillation between the two. It's a choice. It's us trying to decide which one to do. But we can either flee or we can fight, which means fight is step into our fear. Well, when we decide to step into our fear to fight, there's a specific switch that gets kicked in our brain, and that switch, when it's kicked, gives us a dopamine reward, and that is literally courage defined. It's the courage switch, and so our ability to step into those things that we are afraid of, and again, that's after assessing the appropriate amount of risk, because sometimes flee is the right choice too, right? But our ability to step into those things gives us a reward. And again, this is by design. Nature designed us to be explorers, designed us to kind of go out and have to hunt for our food and find new shelter and discover new things. It is literally neurologically why and what has caused us to go from cave dwellers to space explorers. Is this reward system that that is given to us by stepping into our fear. So that's the number one thing about grit is it's going to feel uncomfortable, probably feel a little scary. We have to decide to step in. Once we step in, we're going to have to initiate our perseverance. And perseverance, like I described, is the combination of things. It's kind of like, okay, I'm just going to nug it out, and I'm going to try, whatever trying looks like, and I'm going to have the mental toughness to do that. And then adaptability is literally the idea that everything around us is going to change. I don't think there's nothing in the known universe that doesn't change over time. I mean, that we know of, right? So we can either adapt or we can go extinct. I kind of in the book I talk about you can be the dinosaur or the frog, right? If you choose not to adapt, you will go extinct, right? So adaptation is also what has caused us to be who we are as human beings today, which means, hey, as the environment changes, I'm going to adapt so that I can adapt with that environment. And then through all of that, there's this idea of resilience. We have to be able to, after all this kind of fighting and kind of getting knocked down, we have to be able to bounce back to our baseline. Because if we don't, we're going to fall into entropy and just, collapse from exhaustion, right? So part of grit is the ability to, once I go through all that stuff, I can effectively and efficiently come back to baseline so that I can do it again. And that's the cycle of grit, if there's a way to say it.
Just want to go backwards there before we kind of come forwards. I wanted to go to that frozen point that you made, because I'd never thought about frozen as being the pivot point between either I'm going to fight or I'm going to run. I'm going to retreat or I'm going to fight. And it feels like, especially at the moment, there's a lot of people in that. And I certainly have been in that moment over the past kind of 12 to 18 months of just freeze.
Yeah.
Don't feel like I have enough information. The terrain is completely unclear. Don't know what's going to happen next. Don't know what to do. I have no map here. It's like the bunny in the headlights.
Yeah.
Is there something that you have learned through your career that gets you out of that mode quickly? Is there some kind of, again, I'll use the word barometer, all right, I've got 5 minutes to make a decision. I've got 3 days. What do you use to kick yourself out of that?
Yeah, I mean, in a word, it's thought, right? It's thought and questions, and again, the freeze response can sometimes feel a bit more neurological, right? I mean, if we're in amygdala hijack, right, which is now our frontal lobe is completely receded and we're in limbic response, right? Our body's going to act without us. Sometimes we will feel frozen and it will feel like we can't think. Some people actually faint, but what neurologists will say is that it's actually a retreat mechanism, is when you actually faint, so it's not really frozen, you're fainting as a retreat mechanism. But really what we have to recognize about the freeze response, that middle ground, is actually it's a very, very powerful place to be, because it allows us deliberate thinking, as long as we let it. And I would say most SEALs are designed to freeze first, right? I notice when something really intense happens, immediately I slow down, right? And I begin to think through. I was like, okay, what's going on? And it's a series of questions about our environment. Okay, what about this environment do I understand? What from that list, what can I control and what can I move into? And when I have those answers, I have something to step forward. So I think if most of us feel like we're kind of frozen, it's time to use that frozen time frame to actually begin to ask some questions about our environment, so that we may figure out the next move. And we have to recognize the next move might not necessarily seem like it's the answer. The next move is simply a move, because again, oftentimes to see the next set of options, we have to take a step around the next corner, right? So movement is key in that, and the way we do that is we ask deliberate questions, and those questions are, to put quite simply, what about this environment do I understand? And once we get that list, okay, what about that list can I control in this moment? Pick something, do that, okay, and then ask the question again. Then pick something and do that, and then ask the question. And this is literally how you step through stress, challenge, and uncertainty. You just keep on asking questions.
You know, I love the fact that you just said the next right thing. Actually, this time last year, I actually put together a special podcast series called The Next Right Thing, just literally because it was all I could think of to do.
Yeah.
The normal podcast conversations just didn't feel right at that time, and all I could think of was what's the next right thing. And so I literally put together a series asking people, what's your next right thing? But I want to just keep with that, but move it into the resilience part of this. So I've heard you talk before about the importance of reframes and resets. Mm-hmm. And again, this is something that feels like it's needed on the regular right now, you know, multiple times a day, resetting. What's the key to that reset and reframe that enables resilience?
Yeah, well, first is recovery. And by recovery, it means you have to get out of the... You have to be out of the moment, okay? We can't recover in the moment necessarily, right? So whatever that moment is, whether it's you're in the middle of chemotherapy, right? Or you're in the middle of a tough exam mark, or you're struggling through a period of COVID. Now, if the stress is more chronic, which means it's of duration, then it's going to be incumbent on us to find recovery moments inside of that stress. This is COVID for all of us, right? COVID is continuing on. I mean, we're in a year and a half into this stuff. So all of us need to think about recovery inside of this environment because the stuff's not done. Recovery, the number one way to recover as a human being is sleep, is proper sleep, okay? However, we can also recover through whatever activities bring us to an emotional state of recovery. Emotional states of recovery are joy, peace, contentment, fulfillment, those things. Because when we're in those emotions, what's happening physiologically is we're making a chemical called DHEA. DHEA is a building block of estrogen and testosterone, and it repairs damage done by cortisol. And we all know cortisol is the kind of the action chemical that gets initiated during stress and anger and stuff like that. Completely useful for our physiology, especially when we're in high stress. Cortisol, we need cortisol because it shuts down other things. But it also does some, I shouldn't say damage, it has some wear and tear on our system. So our body is designed to move into parasympathetic state and generate DHEA. Well, we can gauge our production of this just by our emotions. And so activities that bring us joy and peace and contentment are, in fact, recovery activities. Now, again, you and I will completely agree that is highly subjective, okay? For someone, it could be surfing. For another person, it could be church. For another person, it could be reading a book. For some, it could be meditation, you know. I'm someone who, I live here in Virginia, and I go for runs in the woods, you know, and I don't time myself. I don't listen to music. I'm in nature, going at my pace by myself, running in the woods. That's very cathartic for me. It's a recovery moment for me. So we need to find those moments of recovery that allow us to begin to move towards resiliency, begin that bounce back, you know. Now, the truest resiliency comes after reflection. Now, reflection ultimately can't be engaged in really effectively until we've recovered enough so that the emotions of the event no longer affect us that much, right? We're not triggered anymore, because anytime if we're still triggered emotionally by an event, as soon as we get in that emotional state, we cease to be able to answer some really subjective, logical questions about the event, right? So we have to get ourselves to a position where we're not as emotionally affected, and then we need to ask some questions about the event from a subjective position. What did I learn? How did I grow? What mistakes did I make? You know, how is this my fault, right? And then also, how is this someone else's fault? And if we can't, yeah, you're nodding, and we can't ask those two questions unless we're completely over the emotion, right? Because
I'm nodding at the question of how is this my fault?
Yeah.
Because I think that, you know, what did I learn? How did I grow? How is it somebody else's fault? We can answer those relatively easily, usually. Mm-hmm. The how is this my fault is one of those questions that takes the deepest reflection and the most distance to be able to achieve that effectively without going, you know, there are easy ways to answer that question. Well, it's my fault because I should never have started this project with you in the first place.
That's right. Listen to you. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There are fake ways
Yes.
of answering those questions.
That's right.
Easy ways.
That's right.
But if you really want to answer those questions powerfully,
Yeah.
then it takes some distance.
Yeah. And those answers are going to bring you the most growth. Those honest answers, to be honest, to be honest with each other. Now, real quick caveat, because I think we have to mention this. There are some events, there are some traumas and things that happen to us that take a while to recover from, and we can't necessarily do on our own, right? So I always urge people, if you are feeling like it's taking a while and it's hard for you to recover and you're still getting triggered, get help, right? There are people out there who can help you move past those events to a state where you're actually able to ask those subjective questions. But I've had friends who've ended up, unfortunately committing suicide because they're unable to move past that trauma on their own, and just because of bravado, they don't want to go get help. So resilience. Again, we can practice resilience every day with just little tragedies. The fight with the spouse or the traffic jam or the bad day at work. And I would encourage people to practice resilience with little tragedies. So you understand, you can exercise that muscle so that when the big stuff happens, you actually know what needs to happen. But also when the big stuff happens, if you find yourself having trouble doing it on your own, get help and have people help you do it, because it's very powerful.
I'm just thinking about a reframe on that question of fault as well.
Mm-hmm.
To replace that, if that doesn't feel right for you, to replace that with, how was I more powerful than I knew in that moment?
Yeah.
That's still a question around, I am, this starts with me. I am more powerful than I know. I impact my environment in more ways than I know. I am more capable than I know.
Yeah. You could also use the word mistake. I think mistake. What was my mistake is different than how is this my fault, right? Because sometimes we'll make a mistake. It's like, oh my gosh, that was a mistake. Now, fault is a heavy term, right? And you're right. You need to be really distant emotionally to be able to say, how is this my fault? But you could say, hey, what was a mistake I made? What were some mistakes? That's a little bit of softer way of kind of maybe an entry into that ultimate question.
I want to go into another point that you made in the book, which was mastering the pivot. Mm-hmm. And again, it's one of those words I think we all roll our eyes now when we hear the word pivot. However, it is highly necessary at the moment and something that a lot of people are still trying to get their heads around. I want to talk about your personal experience here, because when I was thinking about mastering the pivot after reading the book, I was thinking what a huge pivot you made after you left the SEALs.
Yeah.
How did you approach that? What help did you get? What guidance was useful for you in that moment?
Yeah. Well, the pivot is important for two reasons, and it's because of the two different types of pivots in life. Okay, first there's the pivot that we don't see coming, when life makes us pivot. Okay, and that's COVID, right? There's so many we can. The thing about that is that's always going to happen to all of us, right? So it behooves us to understand that concept just from that aspect alone. But then there are the pivots that we choose. We say, hey, I'm going to deliberately take a different direction, turn 90 degrees, do something else. And that's really all it is. The pivot is really starting something completely fresh, something completely new in your life. And it can be something a little bit less life-changing, like, hey, I'm just going to start a new language. I'm going to start learning a new language, because it's a challenge. It's accepting a challenge. I'm going to go on a trip that I've been putting off, right? That could be a pivot. It could be something more life-changing, like I'm going to change my job, or I'm going to change my identity, and by that I mean I'm going to go from a Navy SEAL to an author, right, or something like that, So I think what we have to recognize, and this is part of the adaptability concept, I think we have to understand that because everything changes, we are going to have to pivot, and it behooves us to understand what that pivot means, and it also behooves us to understand how we deal with pivots. I would guarantee every single listener can think of times in their lives where they've had to pivot in life, whether they chose to or they didn't choose to, and it's a good chance to kind of autopsy one's actions during that time frame. How did you do? What did that feel like when you had to? Was it difficult? And if it was difficult, why? Perhaps there's enough distance at this point where the emotions are dissipated, so you can actually ask some really cool questions about, so you can reflect on that and really start to put together your performance during pivots, and the important thing is if you do this for yourself and you understand where you can effectively pivot and how good you are at it and how bad or how willing you are, you can then start to choose your own pivots. When I finished the SEAL teams coming out of the military, I made a distinct decision. I wanted nothing to do with the military. Some people they leave a career and they just do a job, they get a civilian job with the military afterwards, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's not a pivot in my case. I wanted nothing to do. I wanted something different. And I said, for example, I didn't like talking in front of people, public speaking and all that stuff. So I said, well, I don't like that, and it actually scares me. So I should probably try to do that, And so I got a job with a leadership institute, and I was in front of people, talking, giving speeches, and teaching, interacting with people, and it was a true pivot. And part of that is I'm really interested in kind of understanding our identities and shifting identities. I've been saying that. That's probably going to be the second book is on identity. I think identity is so important. I'm really into what I call elemental behavior, which is who are we at our most raw? How do we show up? The beginning of that is attributes, right? Part of that is also identity. And I think we sometimes deliberately, but oftentimes inadvertently stack identities on ourselves, and then find ourselves, or maybe just begin behaving in ways that are more in service to those identities than they are true to ourselves, right? This is the rabid sports fan, right? Here, let's just use the United States. There are people who are, say, Philadelphia Eagles football team fans, who will beat the crap out of another team's fans because they're football fans of a one team. I mean, so how does that behavior happen when you are? It's just a game, And one of the reasons is because you're absorbing that identity so deeply that you're behaving because of it. So long story short, we could go off on a whole nother tangent, but part of pivoting sometimes is saying, okay, what identity did I have? And then can I take that? Can I put it on the shelf? So me, Navy SEAL, kind of on the shelf, and then try a new identity. And that doesn't mean you can't kind of look back and pull things from that old identity. I mean, I've done that for the book. I've used lessons, but it does mean that I've put it on the shelf. Like I am no longer a Navy SEAL, nor do I purport to be. Nor do I want to be. I mean, you age out of that type of stuff. I'm not even in the military anymore. But can you pivot in a way more deliberately? So, long answer, but that's kind of I guess a rant on pivot.
No, I think that there's something there's a lot of things important there, but one of the things that I'm just kind of holding on to, I've talked on this podcast before about, certain times in my life where I've had to take a massive pivot. Mm-hmm. And one of the best pieces of advice that I ever received during that time was from a mentor of mine. And I had sold out of one business, and I was left with this completely empty, blank piece of paper as to what on earth I was going to do next. And he said to me, he invited me to his farm. We sat in, he's got a tree house on his farm, and we sat down, and I had all these ideas. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. And he said, you know what, the most important thing that you could do right now is just stop. And it goes back to that resetting thing we were talking. He said, you need to stop, because if you start writing the next chapter now, all you are going to do is rewrite the last chapter, because it's all it's your identity. Yeah. You're too bound up in it. You need a gap. You need to take a blank time, sit in the gap for long enough so that when you pick up the pen, you write something completely different. Yeah. And that one piece of advice stood me in the most amazing stead, and has stood me in the most amazing stead yet, to consciously own the gap, consciously own that time in between, to rewrite. Yeah. But there was something else that you said there as well, which actually is a note that I took from the book, I think. When you were talking about public speaking, and you were saying, scared the hell out of me, so I thought, hey, I should do that. Mm-hmm. You had written in the book, one of the reasons you went into the SEALs was the audacity of making a hostile environment your safe haven. Yeah. And how much that appealed to you. Talk to us about that, because I love that thought. Okay, well, this is a hostile environment. What if I were to make this the safest place possible for me? What if I were to get so comfortable here, so resilient that this could be a safe haven for me?
Yeah, part of it is just because I liked the badassery of it.
There is nothing wrong with developing your badassery. That's right. Yeah,
I mean, the fact that these guys, they're always like, the enemy will never be brave enough or stupid enough to follow you into the water. So when in doubt, go there. That I just love that idea. But I do think it's part of this, I guess, deliberate pursuit to try something new, try something different, try something that other people may not try. And I think that's a very powerful way to deliberately pivot. Now, again, it should be in context with your overall purpose and goal. I mean, again, I wouldn't recommend people just to, like, anybody who has nothing to do with the water and doesn't have, nothing in their future or whatever has anything to do. You don't need to go scuba diving at night just to do it, unless it's of meaning to you. But there are so many different things inside of our own niches that are those places that people don't necessarily go because they seem unsafe. And you know what? That's where the iconoclasts are found. I mean, those are the people who set out the discoveries, the explorers, and it's going to be hard. I mean, it's going to be hard, and people are going to probably get after you for it. But a good friend once told me when I was feeling a little bit down one time. He said, you can always tell the pioneers, because they're the ones with arrows on their back, and it's true. I mean, because when you're going to pioneer, when you're going to discover, it's going to take some time. I mean, those people who were the original pioneers on this planet, the people who are space pioneers, they're all people who are stepping out into the unknown. And I think, I mean, again, for me, that's the juice of life. It really is. And I get it. It's not that for everybody. But again, if we think about just neurologically how we get rewarded for that, we get dopamine hits for that. You can step out into the unknown in any capacity. And if you're an introvert, you don't have to start with public speaking. You can go strike up a conversation with a stranger, or you can deliberately go to a dinner party that you might have avoided and make a commitment to start a conversation with at least two people. And you will, as uncomfortable as it might feel, you will feel good after doing it. You'll feel on top of the world. Harness that feeling and practice it with other things is what I would recommend.
Just go into that courage piece for a second, because I know courage is an important part of the attributes. I wanted to talk about the last 5 weeks of third phase in your Navy SEALs training, when you were sent to an island, and what happened at the end there, because I think it's a really beautiful example of courage in action. Yeah.
All right, so real quick, in SEAL training in BUDS, there's 3 phases. Third phase, it's all land warfare, so you learn all your weaponeering and demolition. And for the last 5 weeks, you go out to this island off the coast of San Diego called San Clemente Island, and there you do demolition and weapon training. And the instructors are still screwing with you constantly because it's still SEAL training. And one of the things you have to do there is you have to earn your right to eat every meal, right? So breakfast was like you did a rope climb. Lunch is like a series of pull-ups, push-ups, and sit-ups and things. And then dinner was called a hill run. And so right next to the barracks, there was this huge hill. It was like 200 meters, up and then down again, and pretty steep. And you had to stand at the starting line, and the instructor would hit the stopwatch, and you had to run up to the top and hit this concrete thing and then come back down. And the time with which you had to do that up down decreased. Now they also used the hill run for punishments, but the punishment version of the hill run was called a flight. And the flight version was you stood on this starting line, and instead of just being just your camouflage uniform, right, you now had to wear all of your ammunition, your H harness with all of your ammo and stuff. So that's like 40 pounds or something. And then you had to put this metal moving pallet on your back. Those are like 75 and 80 pounds. And you stood there with this stuff, and then you said request permission to take off, and then they said go, and then you had to run up. Now you weren't running anymore, you were just kind of trudging because you have like 120 pounds of stuff, and to the top of the hill and back. That's a flight, and those were usually reserved for punishments. And so if you were lucky, you didn't have to do any or many. And it was the last day before we were leaving the island. And again, we had started with 160 plus people. There was only 38 of us left, so we were just joking around, ecstatic. We were almost done. And from the outside, we hear this instructor say, Class 210 muster on the flight line. And so we all get out there, and we're all kind of pissed off. And this instructor says, okay, what's the fastest hill run anybody's done? And I think I'll just say 2 minutes. I don't know the time. And he said, okay, you're all going to do flights until someone beats that time, right? Now, again, just a reminder, a hill run is like slick. You're just running up with just your your camouflage uniform. A flight is with all that gear, right? All that weight. And so we're all kind of ticked off. I'm not sure what sound I made or face I made that cued him into me, but he said, Ensign Davini, do you have a problem with that? And so I stepped out of line. I said, yeah, I have a problem with that. And he said, why do you have a problem with that? I said, because this is a stupid idea. Guys are going to get hurt, trying to run flights that fast. It's dumb, and we shouldn't be doing it. And so my whole class was dead silent. And I was like, oh my God, what did I just say, right? The instructor is silent for what seems like forever and says, okay, since Ensign Davini has a problem with this, what we're going to do instead is we're going to run back to the barracks and go to the auditorium, and we're going to watch movies for the rest of the afternoon. And so we're all like stunned, and then somebody starts running, and we're like, it's cool. We get high fives, and I feel great, right? Everything's cool. But that's not the reason why I tell the story. The reason why I would tell the story is 17 years later, I run into two guys from my class. I hadn't seen them in 17 years. I was pretty much an East Coast SEAL team guy, and these guys were West Coast, so we hadn't seen each other. And we're reminiscing, and it's cool. And at one point, one of the guys says, "Hey, sir, do you remember that time you stood up to the instructor on the flight line?" And of course, I hadn't thought about it. I was like, "Sure, I remember." And both of them at that moment say, "Sir, we would trust you anytime, anywhere. We'd follow you anytime, anywhere." And it occurred to me as I thought about it. And I talk about that story when I talk about like deconstructing trust and things like that. But really on a very simple level. The reason why those guys still thought that way, even though they hadn't seen me in 17 years, is because I had stepped out of line. I had stepped out of line in service to them. And when we look at the leadership attributes, these attributes are empathy, selflessness, decisiveness, accountability, and authenticity, right? These are behaviors. And you think about stepping out of line, I was empathetic, right? I could feel, we all felt it. I was a student, so I felt it, but I was really feeling what everybody else was feeling. I was selfless. I didn't know. I honestly thought I would be out there running hills by myself, but I knew it was the right thing to do. So it was integrity there. Like I was doing the right thing for these guys because I cared about them. I was authentic, I was accountable, and I made a decision. And so when we think about leadership especially, and leadership being behaviors, okay, these are, people decide whether or not they want to follow us. I always say you can't self-designate as a leader. Okay, that's like calling yourself good-looking or funny. Okay, someone else decides whether or not you are someone they want to follow, and that's based on your behaviors. And when you behave in that way, that decision stands. Those people think of you as leaders all the way up until you stop behaving that way, right? And that's long-lasting stuff. It really is, especially if you really fundamentally affect them, and they say, this is someone who I want to follow. And I still get, I was in the Navy, I was an officer, so I was always in charge of something, but whether I was just in charge or actually a leader depended on the people who I was in charge of. And I know for a fact that a lot of folks when I was in charge felt like, well, that's just the guy in charge, right? Because I wasn't behaving like a leader. But there are also people who thought of me as a leader, and I know because they've told me. I've gotten letters, I've gotten emails, I've gotten notes. Hey, I loved serving with you. Thank you so much, right? And I know it's because I behaved in a way that affected them. And so we just have to remember that these behaviors and these attributes that actually initiate these behaviors are so important and so powerful, especially when it comes to leadership and being on a team. And it's just a cool way to kind of exemplify that example.
Do you think, just very quickly, do you think the commanding officer was expecting that response, or more than expecting it, do you think that he was trying to pull out that response, or did it come completely left field?
Yeah, it's a good question. I always joke, I don't think the instructor was smart enough to have any ulterior motive on that one. But he was a good guy. All these instructors were good guys, and they were literally playing a role as instructors. Here's what I think. I think that he was screwing with us. I think he probably wasn't going to make us run the hills anyway. He was just going to take us all the way up until like right before we had to, and then just joke, because that's what they did. They just screw with you. But I don't think he expected me to to step up, because I know after that happened, the instructors treated me differently. Because what people understand about SEAL training is when you're, even as an officer going through SEAL training, your instructors are enlisted guys who are putting you through. So those guys are going to put you as an officer through SEAL training. Then you might go to a SEAL team, and they might have you as their boss, right? So they want to make damn sure that they are graduating guys that they want to have in charge. And I think in me, they saw someone who was not afraid to step up, even at risk to myself, to step out of line and say, hey, this is wrong. We're not doing this, And I think that was ultimately what they saw. But do I think they expected that to happen? No, I don't.
But it was a powerful moment either way, right?
Yeah.
What he did, I'm assuming it was what he did was take a moment to think. Again, you got that reflection point and go, actually, this is an opportunity to show that what we expect of you as leaders, what we expect of you in the SEALs, is to take a stand on behalf of your team
when something's wrong.
Yeah. Oh, before I let you go, I just wanted to talk to you very quickly about questions. Mm-hmm. You've talked a lot about the fact that we're question answering machines, and what we do mainly with that power is we lodge the wrong questions in our brains.
Right.
And so I wanted to just quickly talk me through that, the impact of that, and then what are some of the right questions that if we're going to lodge some questions in our brain in the next, day, week, month, what should those questions be?
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's first, it behooves us to understand that our brains are question answering machines. That's exactly how our brains interrogate and figure out the world. It's constantly, we're asking ourselves, have I seen this before? What have I seen? We're looking at something, it's bouncing off of our hippocampus and our occipital lobe, which is the catalog of everything we've seen before. It's saying, have I seen this? And it's making comparisons. So it's constantly asking questions. What we also have to understand is when we deliberately lodge a question into our frontal lobe, right, our conscious mind, our brain has no choice but to begin to come up with answers. Okay, it just does, And I do this experiment with classes that I teach. I just give them a question and say, okay, you get 30 seconds, write down as many things that pop into your head, and you usually get lists. Whatever the question, you get lists of like at least 5 or 6 things, because our brains just start coming up with answers. We do this oftentimes without thinking about it, but we do it the wrong way. We say things like, why am I so bad at this? Why does this always happen to me? Why are these people out to get me? As soon as we ask ourselves that question, our brain begins to come up with answers. And I guarantee you those answers aren't very empowering, and a lot of them are likely ridiculous, okay, because they're just, assumptions or whatever we think. Every high-performing team I've ever encountered, every high-performing human being that I've ever encountered has always asked better questions. They've taken conscious control of the questions they consistently ask themselves, and just ask better ones. So things like, why am I, or what can I learn here? What am I good at? Who's out there that can help me? What can I do in this moment? Those are all questions that when you lodge those questions in your brain, you also get answers to those, right? And sometimes the answers might feel a little ridiculous, but if you don't let yourself off the hook, you keep on saying, what else, you will come up with some answers you can use. And so, yeah, I'm a true believer that the quality of our lives is directly proportional to the quality of questions we ask ourselves on a consistent basis. And people can use this like now. I mean, they can use it today. They can use it in traffic. They can use it in quarantine. They can just take conscious control and notice the questions you ask yourself on a consistent basis and ask different ones. And so in terms of what questions to ask, which I get a lot, the answer is I have no clue because it's highly subjective to the situation. However, I won't dodge the question. I will say that when I'm at a loss of what to ask, if you're at a loss of what to ask, a really good question to ask is, what's a better question right now? Because you will then become, you'll start to get better answers. I know my wife and I did this when we were in quarantine, and we'd get so frustrated. We had to have a German Shepherd. We'd walk around the neighborhood, and sometimes we'd take the first lap just to vent. And then I know it's a couple particular moments where we really felt like, man, there was some stuff going on we just didn't know. And we stopped and we said, okay, let's stop. What's a better question to ask right now? And we just start asking. We just start thinking of better questions and then ask those. And we come up with solutions together. And it's just such a powerful exercise that we can use. We all have access to because our brains just automatically do it. Now, if you can't even ask what a better question to ask is right now, a really good question to ask is, what am I grateful for right now? Because gratitude is an incredibly powerful, it's actually one of the most powerful human emotions. Neurologically, biologically, neurobiologically, it generates such positive chemicals in our system. Deep gratitude has healing effects. It causes DHEA. There's just so much goodness in gratitude, and it almost immediately gets us out of depression. It changes our state almost immediately, right? So So if you are really, really down and out, and you can't even ask what a better question is, ask yourself honestly what you're grateful for, and don't let yourself off the hook. Because sometimes it can feel like the answer is nothing. But I just urge people, if they feel like the answer is nothing, keep asking. Because at the end of the day, if you're breathing, that's pretty darn good. So that's a very basic one people can ask.
What question are you asking right now? For you, your life, with your wife on your walk?
Yeah. Well, I ask, how can I help people explore their own potential? I'm really committed to human evolution. I love the fact that we are cave dwellers that have gone to be space explorers, and I love the fact that we're beings that can imagine something that doesn't exist and bring it into existence. And I'm fascinated, having been around the world and met so many different people and seen so many different people in so many different situations, especially people and kids. I've always asked myself, who's that next Einstein? Where is that next Einstein? And is there stuff I can do and put out there to help that next Einstein bubble to the surface, right? Because I don't think I am. I'm not going to solve intergalactic space travel, which is a cool one, right? But maybe if someone explores their attributes, they can solve it, right? And then we can go on a vacation to some other planet or something like that. So yeah, I want to do my part in helping people understand that potential is not what is. Potential is always what could be, and so it's a constant quest. We never reach our potential. All we can do is explore what could be, and then it's kind of like when you get to that horizon, guess what shows up? The next horizon. And then if you make a commitment to keep on marching towards your horizons, before you know it, you have a life of just a ton of horizons that you've explored and accomplished, and you look back to what you were, and you're like, man, how did I come this far, right? And it's because you just kept on doing it. So that's what I want to help.
One breadcrumb at a time, one adventure at a time, one curveball at a time.
And one horizon at a time.
One horizon at a time. Rich, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. I probably said it in the introduction, but for any of you who want to jump onto Rich's website, take the assessment for the attributes. It's a unique, road-tested, kind of insightful view into areas that we can build on and areas where we can maybe just pivot a little. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a wonderful talking to you. You're in the future, so Monday looks good probably, and so
I am literally intergalactic travel right now.
That's right.
I come to you from the future, and let me tell you, the sun is shining.
That's right. Good.
And all is well.
Awesome. The family, I've told you this before, my family, we have always wanted to get out to Australia, so we will, at some point when all this calms down, we'll get out there. So, and we'll make sure we keep in touch and have a pint. So
I promise you, hand on heart, when you come, then we'll find a restaurant on the harbour and it's dinner on me. We'll get your family and my family.
That sounds great. I look forward to it.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode and have seized hold of at least one tool, idea, or mindset that will help you start raising your own level of influence. Now, for those of you who want to take the next step in your journey or would just love a roadmap to becoming the most influential voice, idea, or brand in your space, then I have good news. You can now download the latest updated version of my ebook, The Influencer Code, from my website, juliemasters.com. Also, there's a link in the show notes. Just pop in your email address, and I promise I will not spam you, but it is jam-packed full of ideas, tools, and case studies that I have come across in my now 20 plus years of doing this work. Not to mention the 7 areas and 7 core questions that I have found to be hands down the most valuable when it comes to immediately lifting your ability to make an impact. Download it, keep it, share it, juice it for all it is worth. I hope it makes a massive difference in both your career and your business. Thank you always to my co-founder and the main brain behind this podcast, Lauren Kelly. You kick my butt in all the right ways. Thank you for making it happen. And if you did enjoy the show, then we would love you to share this podcast and leave us a review on iTunes, Google, Stitcher, whatever your platform of choice happens to be. And don't forget to subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode.